Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about North Korea. It's recently been announced that North Korea's supreme leader, Kim Jong-un, will be making a trip to Russia to meet with President Putin to talk about supplying ammunition and other military equipment to Russia in support of its war in Ukraine. And obviously this is a major development because over the course of the last 15 months we've been talking about the financial pressure that the war in Ukraine is now exerting on the Russian economy. It's costing an absolute fortune to keep this war effort going, and Russia is depleting its reserves. And the predominant reason why the West has applied sanctions against Russia is to apply financial pressure so that the war comes to an end. So the fact that North Korea is now considering supplying more ammunition means that the war potentially could go on for longer and defeats the purpose of the sanctions. But in addition to the war itself, there are also bigger issues at play here because North Korea is a nuclear nation. They have nuclear weapons. And over the course of the last 20 years or so, North Korea have been working on its ballistic missiles, its long-range missiles, to be able to propel those nuclear weapons as far as possible and potentially all the way to the USA. Now, interestingly, the reason that Korea is split into North Korea and South Korea is that the country was divided at the end of World War II, with Russia becoming an ally of North Korea, which adopted the communist principles, and the USA and the West being allies of South Korea. And the war that took place in the 1950s between the two countries was never actually concluded. There was no peace treaty signed, so officially that war still goes on. And there is a lot of ongoing tension between North Korea and South Korea. South Korea get very, very anxious every time North Korea decide to start testing missiles and testing nuclear weapons. So in today's video, I'll give you a brief overview of North Korea. We haven't talked about North Korea before, so I'll go through some of the statistics. And heads up here, they are very secretive in terms of what information is released from North Korea. So I don't have a whole ream of economic data to be able to run through with you, but we'll have a look at what data is available. We'll then talk about the proposed meeting between Kim Jong-un and President Putin. We'll talk about some of the ongoing issues that North Korea are creating with regards to the spy satellite that they've tried to launch recently, the nuclear testing that they've been doing, and the ballistic missiles that they are continuing to trial out, even though they currently have a ban against using any ballistic missiles. And then finally today I'll wrap up with my summaries. So what I think is going on here in terms of the relationship between Russia and North Korea, what the implications of this meeting are for the Ukraine war, and potentially for global peace. Now, once again, as you can see, I am back in the studio presenting these videos, so please let me know what you think of this format versus the previous format. And if you would like to support the channel, please have a look below where you'll find links to my Patreon page, Buy Me a Coffee, and YouTube Super Thanks and membership.
The last time North Korea's Kim Jong-un met Russian leader Vladimir Putin in 2019, he took his armored train to Vladivostok, the closest major Russian city to Pyongyang. At that time, Kim was seeking support in nuclear negotiations with former U.S. President Donald Trump. On Monday, the New York Times reported that he would travel to Russia this month to meet Putin again, under very different circumstances. The paper reported Kim will discuss the possibility of supplying Moscow with weapons to support its war in Ukraine, citing U.S. and allied sources, who also said Kim will travel from Pyongyang again by train, like his father Kim Jong-il, who famously shunned air travel, and they'd meet again in Vladivostok. The Times reported that this time Putin's likely to ask Kim to send Russia artillery shells and anti-tank missiles in exchange for Moscow's technology to improve Pyongyang's satellites and nuclear-powered submarines. Reports of Kim's visit come as the United States last week raised concerns that arms negotiations between Russia and North Korea are advancing actively, and that Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu had tried on a visit to North Korea in July to convince Pyongyang to sell artillery ammunition to Russia. Last week, White House National Security spokesman John Kirby said that North Korea delivered infantry rockets and missiles into Russia last year, and that Moscow has been seeking to acquire additional munitions since then. Pyongyang and Moscow have both previously denied that the North is supplying Russia with arms for use in its war in Ukraine. Last week, though, the Kremlin said that Moscow plans on deepening its mutually respectful relations with Pyongyang, one of its close Cold War allies and also one of a small handful of countries to back Russia's proclaimed annexation of parts of Ukraine last year.
Providing weapons to Russia for use on the battlefield to attack grain silos and the heating infrastructure of major cities as we head into winter, to try to conquer territory that belongs to another sovereign nation, this is not going to reflect well on North Korea, and they will pay a price for this in the international community. And then I think it says a lot that Russia is having to turn to a country like North Korea to seek to bolster its defense capacity in a war that it expected would be over in a week, that in September of 2023, it is going to North Korea to get munitions to try to continue to grind out on the battlefield in Ukraine.
Japan's Okinawa woke to a loud siren early Thursday morning just before 4 a.m. local time, warning them to take cover indoors from a rocket North Korea had launched minutes ago. But that launch ended up as the second failure by Pyongyang to put a military spy satellite in space. North Korea said the rocket booster experienced a problem during its third stage before it could reach orbit. South Korea's military said it tracked the flight from its launch at the North's Sohae satellite launching ground and also concluded it was a failure. Thursday was the North's second failure in 3 months. Its Cholima-1 rocket launch on May 31st met with a similar fate, with the booster and payload plunging into the sea off South Korea's west coast. However, the North's space agency vowed on Thursday to try to launch the satellite again in October. The nuclear-armed country wants to place what would be its first military intelligence satellite into orbit, saying it eventually plans for a fleet of satellites to monitor moves by U.S. and South Korean troops. Thursday's failure comes less than a week after U.S. President Joe Biden met the leaders of South Korea and Japan at Camp David, the presidential retreat, where they agreed to look into conducting joint military exercises to tackle challenges that include North Korea's nuclear and missile threats. And on Monday, the U.S. and South Korea kicked off a 10-day joint military drill known as Uchi Freedom Shield, which the North called a rehearsal for nuclear war. South Korea's Foreign Minister Park Jin and his U.S. and Japan counterparts on Thursday strongly condemned North Korea's rocket launch, which they said was a ballistic missile designed as a space rocket. The South's foreign ministry said that the ministers agreed during a phone call to consider unilateral sanctions in response to Thursday's launch. Washington and Seoul have called Pyongyang's satellite launch a violation of United Nations Security Council resolutions that ban North Korea from testing any technology that could be used to build ballistic missiles. The United States is urging Pyongyang to refrain from, quote, further threatening activity and called on its officials to engage in serious diplomacy.
Now, as I mentioned at the start of the video, North Korea is one of only 9 countries in the world that has nuclear weapons technology. This chart shows the total number of nuclear warheads for each of the 9 countries, and you can see that Russia has the most, with just under 5,900. The United States is second, with around 5,250. China has around 410. France, 290. The United Kingdom, 225. Pakistan 170, India 164, Israel 90, and North Korea is at the bottom of this list but officially has 30 nuclear warheads. And in terms of the timeline of when North Korea developed its nuclear weapons capability, it's only really been over the last 30 years. So it's the youngest of all of the countries that have nuclear weapons capability.
North Korea has conducted a simulated tactical nuclear attack drill that included 2 long-range cruise missiles, the KCNA state news agency said on Sunday. It added that the exercise was to warn enemies the country would be prepared in case of nuclear war. KCNA said the drill was successfully carried out on Saturday when 2 cruise missiles carrying mock nuclear warheads were fired towards the West Sea of the Korean peninsula. Pyongyang also said it would bolster its military deterrence against the United States and South Korea. South Korea's military said the claim of success could be an exaggeration as, quote, not all of them succeeded, Seoul's Yonhap News reported, citing a senior official at the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The latest missile test came just after the joint annual exercises between South Korea and the US came to a close on Thursday. North Korea has been stepping up its military deterrence against Washington and Seoul and has criticised last month's summit agreement between the two on improving military cooperations.
This is North Korea's latest intercontinental ballistic missile, the Hwasong-18. It launched for the second time on Wednesday using something called solid fuel technology. Analysts say that tech allows the missile to fly far enough to strike targets in the US, and North Korea says it radically promotes its nuclear counterattack capability. Solid fuel technology allows missiles to launch with little preparation. It's dense, burns quickly, and uses less complex technology and weight than liquid fuel. The missiles also don't need to be fueled immediately ahead of launch, and the fuel itself can also be stored for an extended period without degrading or breaking down, a common issue with liquid fuel. Solid fuel has actually been around for a long time. The first time it was used was in fireworks, developed by the Chinese centuries ago. It's since made dramatic progress as the US developed more powerful propellants in the mid-20th century. North Korea says the weapon is the core of its nuclear strike force and a warning to the US and other adversaries. If they fire a missile with 1.5 or 2 tons of warhead, it can reach all of the US. In Wednesday's test launch, Japan said the missile flew 74 minutes to an altitude of over 3,700 miles, marking the longest ever flight time for a North Korean missile.
Before we get into the detail of talking about North Korea, I thought it'd be interesting to talk about why Korea is divided into the North and the South. Up until the end of World War II, Korea operated as one country. And Korea is located in a peninsula, which is basically an area of land that's surrounded on 3 sides by water, and it has borders with China and the USSR in the north, and is also located close to the islands of Japan. In 1905, at the end of the Russian-Japanese War, the Treaty of Portsmouth granted Japan undisputed supremacy in Korea and made Korea a Japanese protectorate. Following the outbreak of the Second Chinese-Japanese War in 1937 and World War II in the Pacific in 1941, Japan was in desperate need of additional manpower to replenish the dwindling ranks of military and labour forces, and as a consequence, hundreds of thousands of able-bodied Koreans, both men and women, were drafted to fight for Japan and to work in mines, factories and military bases. As World War II continued to rage on in 1945, US military leaders insisted on encouraging Russian entry into the war against Japan. The Soviet military leaders asked their US counterparts about invading Korea. However, America was reluctant to do so until a successful landing had taken place on the Japanese mainland. In terms of its entry into the war against Japan on August 8, 1945, the USSR pledged to support the independence of Korea, and on the following day, Soviet troops went into action in North Korea. Following the detonation of the atomic bombs by the USA in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, the General Order No. 1, drafted on the 11th of August 1945 by the United States for Japanese surrender terms in Korea, provided for Japanese forces north of latitude 38 degrees to surrender to the Soviets, and those south of that line to the Americans. On the 8th of September, American troops landed in South Korea, and the following day the United States received the Japanese surrender in Seoul. Korea at that point was split into 2 zones, divided by the 38th parallel. The Moscow Conference of December 1945 created a joint USA-USSR commission of the rival US and Soviet military commands in Korea to settle the question of establishing a unified Korea. However, attempts to come to a compromise between the 2 sides failed, and the concept of a divided North and South Korea was established. The Korean People's Army was established in North Korea in February 1948 from Korean communist guerrillas who had previously served with the Chinese People's Liberation Army. By mid-1950, the KPA was made up of 10 infantry divisions, plus other units totalling around 223,000 men. On the 25th of June 1950, the KPA invaded South Korea and rapidly advanced southwards, trapping South Korean and American troops in a small perimeter around the port of Busan. The United Nations was quick to respond and immediately encouraged its members to support South Korea, and many countries sent troops to support the South, including the USA, Great Britain, Australia, Canada, India, New Zealand and South Africa. The United Nations commander, General MacArthur, ordered an amphibious landing at Incheon, a port halfway up the Korean peninsula, and his forces were able to drive the KPA back northwards towards the border between China and North Korea. At this point, China entered the war and pushed the United Nations forces back into the south. During the first half of 1951, fighting stalled and armistice negotiations began. However, the negotiations achieved little success, and the opposing armies continued to face each other in trenches little more than a mile apart for the next 2 years. On the 27th of July 1953, an armistice was signed agreeing that Korea would remain a divided country. The armistice was signed by officials from the United States, the People's Republic of China, North Korea and South Korea. This agreed to bring the fighting of the Korean War to an end. Despite the armistice being signed, no formal peace treaty was ever established, and technically North and South Korea remain at war. The war had lasted for 3 years and 1 month and resulted in roughly 4 million casualties. South Korean casualties were around 1.3 million, including 1 million civilians, and communist casualties were estimated at 2.5 million, including around 1 million civilians. North Korea today has a population of around 26 million people and occupies the northern position of the Korean peninsula and has borders with China and Russia to the north and South Korea to the south. The capital city, Pyongyang, is a major industrial and transport centre near the west coast. North and South Korea face each other across a demilitarised zone, which is 2.5 miles wide and was established by the terms of the 1953 armistice. The demilitarised zone is around 150 miles long and roughly follows the 38° north latitude line. North Korea continues to be a communist country and the state controls all means of production. North Korea does not release any economic data to the outside world, and reliable information on the performance of the North Korean economy is very difficult to obtain. The country is not known to have any significant oil or gas reserves. However, it does have an abundance of other commodities such as iron ore, coal, gold, magnesium, lead, zinc, tungsten and graphite. In terms of its international trade, the majority of imports are taken directly from China. However, the total volume of all imports in 2022 was around $900 million. And in terms of exports, the main trading partner is also China, and the total value of all exports in 2022 was around $192 million. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video really to let you know what's going on in terms of the relationship between Russia and North Korea. Now, North Korea is in the headlines a lot. They seem to be doing weapons tests on a regular basis. And this always causes a lot of anxiety for countries such as South Korea and Japan, who are obviously located very close geographically and have a lot of history with North Korea. Now, as we talked about earlier in the video, we don't really have a good handle as to what's going on in the economy of North Korea. So I can't really tell you whether it's thriving, whether they're doing well, whether they're generating lots of cash to be able to fund more missile programs, to give more weapons to Russia. It's very difficult to work out what exactly is happening. But what we've seen in terms of the footage from today's video is that North Korea obviously is developing its weapons technology. In the 1960s, it was focused on developing nuclear capability, and it now has nuclear weapons at its disposal. And for a country with a population of only around 26 million, North Korea makes a lot of noise on the military front. It's constantly making threats to lots of countries all around it, talking about things like doing practices for a nuclear war and talking about whether or not it's got missiles that it could launch all over the USA. And up until this point in time, North Korea has acted independently. It hasn't really sought to team up with any other countries. It's making threats all on its own. However, what we're seeing from the proposed meeting between the leader of North Korea and President Putin is that there now seems to be the concept of a global alliance. And this obviously works well from Russia's point of view. Over the course of the last 18 months, Russia has alienated itself from the West. The war in Ukraine has really polarised which countries are prepared to carry on dealing with Russia and which aren't. And as we've seen from all the economics videos that I've posted, Russia has developed its relationship with China and India significantly. It's selling a lot of oil and other commodities into those countries, which obviously is good news from Russia's point of view because they are the two biggest countries in the world in terms of population. But in terms of military power, India isn't looking to get involved with Russia, and China so far has remained neutral. But North Korea has now lifted its head above the parapet and has signalled clear intent that it wants to get closer to Russia. By providing weapons that will be used in Ukraine, there is a clear line in the sand. North Korea is backing Russia in the war in Ukraine. And this obviously puts it offside in terms of all of the West. Now, there are already some sanctions in place against North Korea, predominantly because they've been using and testing ballistic missiles, which would be the only way that they'd be able to get nuclear weapons to land in the USA. And unfortunately, I can't really give you any evaluation as to what the impact of those sanctions has been, because we don't have any data at all to deal with. But what we do know is that North Korea are quite an aggressive military power, and they've got an axe to grind with lots of different countries. They've got a beef with South Korea, they've got a beef with Japan, and they've got a beef with the USA. And that is a dangerous combination when you're looking at where Russia is right now, because Russia is up against all of those nations. And from what we've seen in today's video, the trade-off in terms of the weapons that North Korea are giving to Russia is that Russia is going to help North Korea develop its technology in terms of its spy satellites and its nuclear submarines. And obviously, nuclear submarines represent a threat to global peace. Because if a submarine is loaded with nuclear warheads, then obviously that would give the potential to make nuclear strikes anywhere around the world, depending on where that submarine is. So there is a very real risk here. But clearly, from Russia's point of view, they're not concerned about helping North Korea develop all of that technology because they're one of their allies. It's very unlikely that North Korea would look to start any sort of conflict with Russia. And Russia right now is looking for as many friends as possible, particularly ones who are interested in helping it from a military perspective. So in terms of the global alarm bells, the meeting that's being held between North Korea and Russia later this month does raise concerns. It does set off some of those alarm bells because we've got two military powers, both of whom have nuclear weapons, both of whom are quite aggressive, and both of whom have a beef with the West, teaming up and helping each other out. And as we saw earlier in the video, the USA has sent a clear warning to North Korea that it should not be seen to be helping Russia. However, North Korea doesn't usually heed any of these warnings. It doesn't tend to back down. It won't be bullied. It won't be threatened. So I think it's likely that North Korea and Russia will strengthen their relationship. It's likely that North Korea will supply some military equipment to Russia to help with the war in Ukraine. Russia is equally likely to help North Korea develop its technology in terms of spy satellites and nuclear submarines, and all of that raises the risk of more military conflict occurring somewhere around the world, whether it be in Asia, Europe, or somewhere else. So I'll keep you posted as soon as any further news about this proposed meeting is announced. Hopefully you've enjoyed today's video. It was a slightly different flavour. We didn't get into the economics because there's very little economic data to dive into for North Korea. But we talked about lots of other things that I think are important in terms of the world, what's going on today, and the risks of more military conflicts happening over the course of the next 6 to 12 months. So hopefully you enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.